All right, it's 12 o'clock. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us to the Southeastern Indiana Animal Science Lunch and Learn. I'm Jill Richards. I'm from Ohio County. Today we're going to have Miranda Edge from Harrison County, Cora Carter from Bartholomew County, and Molley Scott from Crawford County going over body condition scores. There, now it's moving on. Okay. Cora, turning it over to you.
All right, so I'm going to talk just a little bit about body condition scoring in sheep and goats. Both sheep and goats use the same scale. They use a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being emaciated and 5 being extremely fat or obese. Most animals on most farms will have a BCS from 2 to 4. Body condition in sheep and goats can indicate a lot of issues if you have a poor body condition score. So you can see that if you have a lower body condition score, like a 1 or a 2, you might have heavy parasite loads, you might have bad teeth, diseases, lameness, poor nutrition. You can see a lot of these diseases or problems, issues that come up. You can kind of tell that something's going on by looking at the body condition score of your animal. Body condition score can also provide an indicator of potential reproductive success. If your animal is too thin, you might not be able to get the animals bred, or they might only have 1 lamb or kid. If they're too fat, they also might not have twins or triplets, they might not multiple, and they may suffer from pregnancy toxemia. Not to mention there's increased dystocia risk or problems in giving birth if there's fat in the birth canal. So if the animal is extremely obese, they may have problems with that kind of issues as well. Can you go to the next slide, please? Body condition score can't be done just by looking at an animal. Sheep especially are known for having wool. Even hair sheep and goats may carry a heavy winter coat. So you may not be able to tell an accurate body condition score just by looking at it. The animal is best felt by touch. So there's several places on a sheep or a goat you can feel along the spinal processes. That's the arrows in this diagram. This diagram is kind of a cut across the middle of an animal. That pointy thing in the middle is a vertebrae. So sheep vertebrae have these pointy spinal processes, and those gray circles are the loin on either side of the backbone of the animal. So if you can feel those bony processes, that gives you an indicator of body condition score, and we'll go into that in the next slides. You can also check their sternum or their breastbone. Can you go back real quick? Sorry. And their ribs and the spaces in between the ribs. When you're palpating the back, the lumbar area, you can feel the lumbar vertebrae and those 2 horizontal protrusions that are called transverse processes. And if you run your hand along the area, you try to gently to grab those little processes that point out. And you can kind of compare that to other animals. If you move along the sternum and the rib cage, you want to feel the amount of fat cover in both of those areas. Okay, now you can go on to the next slide. You should use the body condition score in half measures in between 2 and 4. That gives you a little bit more relative ability to not necessarily know exactly whether it's a 2 or a 3. If you're having trouble placing your animal in a 2 or a 3, you can't tell which it is, you can give it a 2.5. They're really helpful because relative scores are more important than getting each animal exactly correct. The difference between a 3 and a 3.5 is not that much, but the difference between a 2.5 and a 4 might be cause for concern. So this is just a subjective way to evaluate the status of your flock or herd. It's really all about you getting to know your animals and kind of recognizing how that animal changes over time and recognizing that one day it may be a 2, and then a few months later with some good work and some nutrition, you might be up to a 3 or a 4 on that animal. Okay, you can go to the next slide. So this is for sheep specifically. The pictures off to the right are your condition score 1 at the top down to 5 at the bottom. And you can see on this chart over to the left-hand side that there are different scores that are optimum for different production stages. When you're breeding, you want your animals to be a little bit more, have a little more finish on them than when you're lambing. So you can see that breeding is 3 to 4, but you want them to be a little bit lower to 3 to 3.5 or 3.5 to 4, depending on what your lambing is going to be, singles versus twins. These very difficult to read descriptions here that are very small are the little indicators of what you want to be looking for in that condition. Score 1, the appearance is very narrow, their backbone is raised and it's hollow behind the ribs, the tail feels bony and it has prominent bones. Basically, this is a bony animal. Condition 2, backbone is raised, but it's smooth. The ribs are easily felt, but the tailbone is easily detectable, and the neck is thin. Condition score 3, the backbone is slightly raised. The ribs are smooth, but you can feel them, and the tailbones are barely detectable. And condition 4, appearance is well-rounded. The backbone can just barely be felt. The ribs are covered, and the tail is firm and rounded. Condition 5, appearance is well-rounded, backbone is hardly detectable, ribs cannot be felt, and the tail is fat. So that's an obese animal there at the end. Okay, and then the last slide that I have is about the goats. So if you can go on to the next slide. All right, so goats are just slightly different. I know that dairy goats and meat goats are going to be a little bit different, but they do use the same score. So the number 1 is very thin, easy to see and feel all the bones, the rib cage. There's no fat over the loin. Thin, and is the number 2. Easy to feel bones, but smooth. There's an even cover. Good condition is a 3. That's what you're looking for most of the time. Smooth and rounded cover over all the animal. And 4 is fat. You can feel bones with firm pressure, but there is some fat over the loin eye. And obese is where everything is smooth and covered in fat. And I like that it says on the loin eye that it may be lumpy or jiggly. So that's a technical term there. All right, so that's sheep and goats. So I'll hand it over to Jill and Molly, I think, are doing the beef next.
Okay, so we're going to roll right into beef cattle, and body condition scoring in cattle is a numerical value on a scale of 1 to 9, a scoring system that is visually evaluates the amount of condition. So body condition score visually evaluates the amount of condition, and when we're talking about condition in beef cattle, we're talking subcutaneous fat, and the animal is carrying. So when we're looking at the effects of body condition scoring cattle, it's going to affect the calving intervals. So how often are those cattle rebreeding back after postpartum? The lactation performance in cattle, it's going to affect pregnancy rate and your conception rate when breeding back your heifers or cows. It's going to affect the calf, the overall health of the calf. So when these cattle are calving, is the health of the calf, where is it at? Vigorous health, the supplemental feed cost, and dystocia heifers. So a lot of this information is going to sound repetitive from what Cora was explaining, and a lot of it does go hand in hand. So we're going to move on to the next slide and talk about strategic times of when we need to be checking the condition score in cattle. So important 60 days prior to weaning, we want to make sure we're early weaning decisions if cows are thin or where they're at on the condition score. So we're going to look at some pictures later on in the presentation of the 1 to 9. So it follows the same concept as sheep and goats, 1 being emaciated and 9 being fat or obese. So times to look at body conditioning scores are weaning. The heifers and older cows, they might have trouble gaining weight, or keeping conditions. We want to keep a watch on the status of where they're at. We also want to make sure 100 days prior to calving, it's noted that the last chance for that animal to gain condition in a reasonable manner. So going into having her baby, we want to make sure she's where she needs to be and has enough condition to have that calf and then start the lactation process. We want to take note at calving. Cows, they need to gain more, but gain will be expensive at that point since their nutrition is at a high demand, and at that stage of production, it's going to take more money and more time and TLC to get those thin cows back to the body condition score that they need to be at. Same concept at breeding. Thin cows need to gain, but it's also expensive at that point. So just knowing what your animals are and their condition is important. It's going to be more cost efficient if you visually, catch it early on versus fixing the problem once it occurs. So we'll move on to the next slide. Is this me or you get Jill?
You'll see that the strategic locations to evaluate your animal body condition score. The cattle lay fat in a certain order. So first, the fat is going to lay on the back and loin area, which you can follow this chart when you're looking at them. The second place will be followed by their ribs. Next place to fill will be their tail head, followed by the brisket. And then after the brisket is filled with fat, then the flank starts to fill in. And that's kind of the order that you can tell on this chart when you're looking at that. That way it'll help you get your body condition score. Once all of these areas have been filled in, fat will start to accumulate in the udder and mammary regions as well for cattle. So here's another chart that helps kind of figure out where their body condition score is. So if you're looking at the fat and the brisket and flank, you won't have any in body condition scores 3, 4, or 5, but you'll start to get some through 6, and they'll become full 7, 8, and so on. And so you can read through this chart and look through it. The outline of the ribs are visible, definitely in body condition score 3, 3 to 5 in body condition score 4. That'll be where their ribs are, and you can see how as you go on into a higher number, there's going to be less ribs that are going to be visible. Outline of the spine is the same way. The outline of the hip is visible with 3 and 4, 5 and 6, slightly in 7, but you will not see any hip 8 and above. Fat in the udder and tail head, there won't be any of that fat if your body condition score 3, 4, 5, or 6, even 7. You're going to start getting a lot of that when you get to 8 and 9. So that's when it starts to become a concern that you're getting to the obese range. So here's just some better pictures to kind of give you a better idea. So 4 and 5, those look pretty similar. You can see in some of the pictures, whether it's in the green grass or if it's on snow, when they have a little more hair this time of year, it's harder to tell if the ribs are covered or exactly what the backbone looks like, or see exactly where the bone structure is. And it's a little bit easier in the summertime when hopefully the cattle have lost a lot of their hair and it's a little more slick. So this gives you an idea of what it would look like during both different seasons, and kind of give you some samples of looking at the front where the brisket is, the side view so you can see the ribs, and you can also see some of the hips there as well. And then from behind, so you can really see the tail head to see where fat's being deposited, and you can see down the back to see the backbone. So with that, we'll move on to our horse topic, which is Miranda.
Okay, thanks. So starting with the horse, we actually have a very similar numerical scoring system of 1 to 9. I've seen where some people will use just a 1 to 5 scoring system like the sheep and goats, but it's more often or not used for using the 1 to 9 scoring system as we do in beef cattle. So just like beef cattle, it's going to cause issues with the foaling interval with longer postpartum intervals. The lactation performance can be affected. Pregnancy rates, obese horses tend to not cycle as well. And since they are only seasonal cyclers, that gives us a lower chance of getting that animal pregnant before she goes out of cycle for the season. The healthy and vigor of the foal can be affected definitely by the body condition of the mare. Dystocia, again, like all the animals we've talked about, heavy animals have a harder time giving birth, so that extra fat in the birth canal can definitely cause some dystocia and issues with that foaling time. Along with those reproduction and growth that we're looking at, horses are also used as athletes, and so their body condition is very heavily important for performance and athleticism. And we also see some metabolic diseases that maybe aren't as apparent in some of our other livestock. So next slide, please. And again, strategic locations to evaluate body conditions, you're going to see similar characteristics, but we also show that on the horse, you can look at their crest line, and the heavier they get, the bigger that gets and the harder it gets. The top line will become flat and then start to actually cave in along the spine with excess fat. And then, of course, on the opposite end, you'll see more of that spine. So top line is a great location to start evaluating your body condition. The tail head will collect extra fat and show pockets of fat around the tail, just as in other livestock. Your ribs are a good place to show visually, as well as being able to feel across that, the different scores. And then again, in the throat latch, you'll see excess fat and thickness in that area to show a difference in your body conditions when it goes up. Next slide. So the condition scoring chart, just like the others, shows a 1 through 9 scale with visuals. These are really hard to read, but the number 1 value is looking at a very emaciated horse with the ribs and hip, top line, and tailbone protruding extremely. The crest is non-existent, and the throat latch is very, very thin. This horse is severely malnourished at this point with a lack of muscle development. At 2, the horse is considered very thin, has a bit more muscling development and maybe not as protruding on the hip bones and tail head, but you can definitely still see ribs and that top line along with the withers being a little higher than when we move into higher scoring. 3, they start to get a little bit more muscling, a little bit of fat deposit. Again, the ribs are still easy to see. You may not have as high of a wither protrusion, and that top line starts to get a little bit smoother, but you may see still some peaks around the hip bones and the tail head. Next slide, please. And 4, this is moderately thin, and depending on what that horse is being used for, a 4 may be a acceptable condition. This would be like a racehorse, endurance, or another horse that's doing long distance and high energy exercises that needs to have maybe a little less fat and a little bit more length of muscling development to be able to maintain speed and energy over long periods of time. And here you'll be able to possibly see the ribs, definitely feel them, but you should not have a protruding tailbone and hip bone, and your neck and throat latch will be a normal thickness and very supple and not hard at all. When you move into 5, this is where, you've got that level and even playing field for everything. This is what most people would consider a fit horse. And this is where you won't be able to see the ribs, but still be able to feel them. The withers do not protrude. You start to get a little bit more thickness on that crest, depending on what that animal is doing, whether it's reproduction or maybe it's a trail riding or a performance horse. This is fine as long as there's still suppleness within that neck and they can still move and control their neck and body movements well. The tail head may start to get full, but there should not be pockets of fat. When you get into 6, this is moderately fleshy. At the beginning of the season, in January, when we start to breed animals, we may find that our mares tend to be a little bit higher in that 6 range, especially if they've been off of their foals have been off lactation for a few months and they've been put back into a pasture or added some extra grain to bring their body condition back up. This is still considered okay, but when we move into, thanks Jill, you can go ahead to the next one. When you move into 7, this is definitely a fleshy horse. There's definitely a little excess fat. It's harder to fill the ribs, and that crest is going to start to get a little harder. It makes it a little bit more difficult for the animal to bend their neck and become supple when asked to exercise. Your chest and the throat latch is going to start to get a little bit thicker, and that tail head will start to show a little bit more padding on the fat. 8 is considered fat. So anywhere that we have talked about with fat, there's going to be definite levels of fat covering the muscle, and you will not be able to feel the ribs without really, really pushing hard. And finally, extremely fat is just going to be that extra fat all over. If you think about that little fat miniature pony, especially this time of year that looks more like a marshmallow on sticks, that's considered a 9 and very, very unhealthy for that animal, as it could cause some extra metabolic issues, very similar to an insulin deficiency or insulin misuse of insulin within their body, that could cause some extra issues down the road, whether it's within performance, health, or in reproduction. Next slide, please. So we can look at an example of this one horse, with the top left being this gelding as a 3-year-old just after being castrated. So studs tend to have a little, they have extra testosterone. They tend to have a better body build. They don't hold as much fat as maybe a gelding. Once you castrate and lose that testosterone, they start to gain a little bit of weight. So this horse at 3 years old still looks in a decent body condition of maybe a 5.5 to 6. Over in the top right, this horse is under full athletic requests. We're asking him to jump. We're asking him to have some endurance and move quickly when asked, and do some bending and extra things that he's going to need that extra muscle development and less fat. He's about 6 to 7 years old at this time, and I would consider him a solid 5 in the body conditioning. Now being a little bit older, this horse is 14 and maybe not used as much as he was when he was younger. And so he has definitely built a lot more, or added a little bit more fat padding to his body. And we would see him more on a body condition score of 7.5 to 8 at this point in time. It's kind of hard to see with his head down, but his crest is extremely thick, and it's getting to be pretty hard and harder for him to move. His throat latch is very thick. If you were to try to rub your hands across his ribs, you cannot feel them anymore. And looking from above, his top line is starting to kind of roll down, and he's got that extra fat padding across his top line and into his tail head, where those fat pockets will start to develop. So next slide, please. So we have strategic times, just kind of like any other livestock animals. You're going to want to make sure 6 days prior to weaning that mare is still in good condition and the foal is not sucking her down too much. You might want to look at early weaning decisions, especially if that foal is grazing and is eating grain readily and can probably take care of itself. At foaling, those thin mares need to gain just like cattle or sheep or goats. But it's going to take a lot more because she's pushing a lot more of that energy into the demand of the foal instead of herself. Breeding, those thin mares should gain. It's going to be a little bit more expensive again. Usually this is going to be in the winter. They've just come off of weaning, and they really need to be in good condition to be able to hold on to a pregnancy. If you've got heavy mares, they may not cycle. Heavy stallions definitely have a harder time with performing. We don't see a whole lot of heavy stallions unless they get extra loves, extra carrots, and not enough exercise. So it's very important for even stallions that have that extra testosterone to have extra energy and exercise so that they can maintain that good weight and still be able to perform correctly. In addition to reproduction and regular gain, when we ask a young horse or a new horse to start a new exercise regime, whether that's just starting under saddle or we've now asked the trail horse to go into a performance as a 4-H animal. Those thinner horses may not have the energy to be pushed very hard quickly, and so the muscling development is not there, and they will get sore, they will get tired faster, and we'll need a little extra maintenance, a little extra feed, and develop time to develop those muscles so that they can perform a harder exercise than what they're used to. On the other side, if you've got an animal that has been in exercise but maybe has come up lame or has some sort of an injury and has to go on stall rest and cannot be exercised regularly, they tend to gain a little bit of weight because we may be still feeding them the same and they're not getting the same amount of injury or exercises rather. And so when we ask that horse to go back into the exact same exercise as what they were doing before, you may show extra injury or a different injury if pushed too hard. Your laminitis is also a major increase, as when they stand, their bone formation in their hooves can start to rotate and cause some injury to their feet and their hooves. Next. Okay, so the fun one we wanted to add to the end. There's not an official scoring system for poultry, but I wanted to add this in, and it may be more of a humor for you all, but we wanted to talk about conditioning in poultry because at least this time of year they are molting, maybe they're not laying, and people are starting to think about what they're going to do in this spring, whether it's going to try to find fertilized eggs around home, try to have hens that produce fertilized eggs for yourself, or buy new chicks. So when we look at the body condition in poultry, we're going to be working on maintaining laying capabilities, muscle development, especially in the meat chickens, how often they molt and how badly they molt, and then of course their fertility just in other livestock that we've talked about today. Next. Strategic locations. This particular bird is in molt, so it's a little bit easier because she has less feathering to be able to look at her neck, chest, feathers, and thighs. Thighs more often than not in our meat chickens because that's where a lot of the thickness of the meat development will be seen. In the chest, you're definitely going to be able to see the breast development, and that's going to look at the integrity and the health of the bird. Feathers give you a lot of indications. If they're dull, if they're stripped, they start to fall out at a time where you don't expect them to molt. There may be something wrong with the nutrition of that chicken. They do molt once a year. We expect that, but the amount of molting, so I had some of these birds that were very young this year, and when we added new animals to our flock during molt, they got a little extra stressed and I think pushed away from some of the feed bins. And so they did end up losing a lot more of their feathers than we had expected. And so we tried to add extra feeding areas so that everyone was able to spread out and get enough feed. And so they did come back into their feathers quickly, and everybody looks much better today. Next slide, please. So difference between a meat bird, a laying breed, and dual purpose. On the bottom, you'll see these meat birds. A lot of times, if you think of the Tyson chickens or some of those meat birds that we see at the fair, they look like they really can't walk. And at a point in time when they age, it does get harder for them to hold their body up. They've got a lot of weight that we're asking for them to build within that breast muscle and the thighs. And when we get over a weight, they can stress some of their tendons and even break some legs. And so making sure that we don't overfeed them helps to keep them healthy and their ability to continue to move around, maybe graze if we're asking them to be pasture-fed meat chickens. And then on the other hand, if they do break their legs, they could possibly cause bruising within that meat, and then we've lost the quality of meat that in that particular bird. Laying breeds, we're going to make sure that they are still within a good body condition. A lot of times I think you can catch some of these a little bit better than like your dual purpose breeds that are bigger, like the one on the right, especially if they're your backyard birds and they're kind of a pet. Picking them up and feeling them on a regular basis. If you start to feel that breastbone a little bit more than you normally would, look at maybe why they're not eating as much, or if you've got some new animals in the flock that they're not allowing them to eat, that might be something you need to look at, adding deterrents, extra feed spaces or feeding spaces so that everyone's able to eat. And then those dual purposes tend to be a little bit bigger. They have a lot more feathering in some cases, like this Brahma. And so it's a little harder for us to look at him. Again, at molting, and this is a year-old bird, so he's just now put his new feathers in. We've been able to look at his health and his body condition as he's building in his new feathers and see that he's doing a good job maintaining weight and being able to gain and grow as a young bird. Next. And that is all we have for today. If anybody wants to add any extra information, but we appreciate you all coming and listening to our discussions on body condition scores. We are back in a couple of weeks to talk about pasture mixes. So please tune in for that. Tell your friends about our Lunch and Learn, and we hope that you learned something from today, and we see you next time.